This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Mother's Day is almost here, and you can get her the most beautiful time-tested gift around. A watch she can wear every day from Movement. Whether mom's into classic dress watches, rare and refined ceramics, or tried-and-true bestsellers, Movement has something she'll love. And right now, you can save big on the best Mother's Day gift ever with up to 50% off site-wide during Movement's Mother's Day sale at MVMT.com. Again, that's up to 50% off at MVMT.com.
Hi, my name is Scott Bellis. I played Max Fennig on The X-Files. And you're listening to the X-Cast.
Welcome back, everyone, to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I am Tony Black, your host, as almost always, and we've got another really exciting special guest on for this episode, talking about the X-Files. It's a real pleasure to have on someone I know most of you will have heard of in relation to the show. It's the science advisor to the X-Files, Dr. Anne Simon. Anne, so lovely to have you on the show.
It's wonderful to be here, Tony. Great talking with you.
Absolutely, yeah. It's we've corresponded a little bit over Twitter recently, but it's just really nice to have somebody on the show who has such a real input with fans. I'm not sure there's anyone else related to the X-Files production that does so much on social media as you do. So loads of people will know who you are.
Well, I love social media. I actually started with Twitter when I was on the set when the X-Files came back 2 years ago, and I thought, I'm taking some fun pictures and I'm talking with people. I wonder if anyone would be interested. And so I started putting a few things out, and wow, there were a lot of X-Files fans on Twitter.
As we're discovering as we go through this podcast, we've got a really great little community now who follow the X-Cast and obviously retweet a lot of what you do and all this kind of thing. So it's lovely. It's really nice to see those people are out there, and I think hopefully this podcast will give them a little bit more insight into your own fandom, because we're going to start with the 5 questions of X, which I ask quite a few people who come on the show and record and things like this about the X-Files. Now, the first question may be something people already kind of know, but in case they don't, because it is in your book and things like this, but in case they don't, how and when did you first discover the X-Files?
I actually first discovered the X-Files the very first episode. So I saw that there was a new show on television that had a scientist as a main character, and I thought, well, it's probably going to be awful, but why don't I just try it? And I turned it on, and I was hooked. It took 5 minutes. I loved the show. I loved the feel of the show, the intelligent writing. I loved the character of Dana Scully. I was a fan from the first episode, and the fun part was it wasn't until halfway through the series that I realized the Chris Carter, who was the executive producer, was the Chris Carter who I knew so well, and that was when my mother called and said, Chris, he's doing this show called The X-Files. I said, The X-Files? I love The X-Files. And she said, well, he needs to talk to a scientist, a biologist, and of course, there's you, and he knows you. And would you mind talking with him? I was like, yeah, oh, sure, I'd mind. No, I was thrilled. And so he called me that evening, and we started talking about the last episode of the first season, the Erlenmeyer Flask. And it was so enjoyable. And I just, whoever thought that a show that had become my favorite television show was a show that I could actually have some input into.
That was one of the really nice, surprising facts I hadn't heard of when I read your book, The Real Science Behind the X-Files, where, it was just a happenstance that it was somebody you knew. I thought that was a really great way of of discovering the show and a really great way into it. And obviously, so, you've been there since the very beginning. You've been there since season 1, so 25 years of involvement in the show, Anne. It's pretty astonishing. Not everyone involved in the X-Files can claim that, really.
Well, that's true. But I've always been there for Chris when he had questions. And the wonderful thing was on the revival 2 years ago, I had major input into one of the episodes, and that was certainly the most fun that I've had helping with the series.
Yeah, and we will get into that, and that may tie into my next question, or it may not. But what would you say your favourite episode of the X-Files is?
I think it ties into your this question. So, my favorite episode, of course, has to be the episode that I helped with so much, and the episode that I got story credit for, and that was My Struggle Too, the last episode of the revival, season 10. It was just wonderful. I was reading the script every day as Chris was writing it, and giving him input. It was, he asked me, how can I kill off everybody? And I'm like, everybody? Not everybody. I said, not the chosen few, right? And he goes, yeah, not the chosen few. So I came up with this crazy way of using this new technology called CRISPR-Cas to delete out a particular gene that would give everybody AIDS without HIV. It would take away their immune systems, and then they could die from a common cold. And he loved it, and so that all became part of that show. So yes, My Struggle Too was my favorite episode. Now, if I don't include that episode, my favorite episode is the Postmodern Prometheus.
Oh, good choice. Yeah.
And I actually had input into that episode because it was based on an idea of mine. But but even if it wasn't based on an idea, I still loved that episode, the black and white episode that I just thought was so creative and had this mad scientist. I'm not really into mad scientists, being a scientist, but this guy was so over the top, and it was just so wonderful. I never get tired of watching that episode.
It is a really great episode. It has some interesting back and forth between fandom as to whether or not people love it, but I think it's unlike anything else the show ever did, really. So it really does stand out in that way. In terms of your favourite season, then, overall, which is obviously a bigger question because it covers a lot of episodes, would you say season 10, given My Struggle 2, or would you go for something different?
Well, certainly having the X-Files come back was amazing. And I liked many of the episodes, and there were only 6. I'm really enjoying this year's episodes. Now, I understand that it's not on yet in the UK, but people will have something amazing to look forward to because there have been 3 absolutely wonderful episodes on so far.
As this interview goes out, though, I think it's roughly the point where I think it's the 5th of February in the UK, so it may either be out or may just be about to premiere.
Oh, so that's very exciting there.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. But I would have to say my favorite season was the first season because it was remarkable to have a series on the air that didn't belittle your intelligence, that really had such good dialogue and such interesting, well-developed characters. And I really became engrossed in the X-Files during that season. I mean, I never missed it. And as a assistant professor, you really have a lot of other things going on in your life. But this is a show that I didn't miss. I loved the interaction between the characters. I loved that a scientist was being portrayed in a realistic light. The character of Dana Scully, she was a real scientist. I mean, she didn't know everything. She wasn't there to be evil. She wasn't there to, I mean, she was there to be helpful. She was there to figure out what was going on, and she reasoned things out. And granted, she was usually wrong. There were no science explanations for all these strange things that were going on. But she did what a scientist did. I mean, she came up with reasonable hypotheses, and then when the data didn't fit the hypotheses, she sort of changed her mind. Took her a while, but eventually she did.
But she always has these, and right from the beginning, yeah, she always has ideas and theories that could. I mean, if it wasn't a show where the whole idea is that Mulder believing all this amazing, strange stuff is right, and that wasn't essentially the conceit, that a lot of the time he's right, Scully's explanations would 99% of the time make the most sense and be the most logical to actually happen. So that's what was great, in that there was a lot of work put in right from the beginning with Scully for her responses in almost every episode to make as much sense, if not more sense, than the crazy theories Mulder had, even if Mulder turns out to be right in the show, if you see what I mean. That works so well, and I think that was one of the reasons that she works so well as a character.
Well, she was very believable, and I give a lot of credit to the actress Gillian Anderson and to the dialogue that was being written for her, because she had to make sense, and then she had to be wrong, but continue to make sense as these episodes progress. But during the first season, you really didn't know what was going on. You didn't know were the aliens real. You didn't know if there was a scientific explanation. It wasn't until the last episode of the first season where you understood clearly that there was something going on, something, extraterrestrial going on.
Yeah, and it took a while to really unfurl, didn't it? So yeah, it's a good answer. We've had a few people say season 1 over the years, and it's not a season that gets a lot of love, but I think it is a particularly good one. So obviously, given we've been talking about Scully, I don't know if you would class her as your favourite character, but would you say Scully if you had to choose? Or it can be anyone. It doesn't have to be Mulder or Scully, but who would you say your favourite character is?
No, I would have to say that my favorite character was Dana Scully. This was the first show to portray scientists in a favorable light, and that the scientist was a woman was just bonus points. So scientists, we were used to seeing ourselves portrayed as unfeeling and unemotional, and where the ends justified the means, and the traditional mad scientist, and that's was not conducive to getting young people interested in going into science. In fact, quite the opposite. So having this wonderful character on television led to what we call the Scully effect, which is that so many young people, and especially a lot of young women, decided to go into science because of the character of Dana Scully. And in fact, a postdoctoral scientist in my lab, his wife, who is a biologist who works at the FBI, is there because of Dana Scully.
That's wonderful. That really is. It's the same effect in many ways that seeing, empowering women on shows such as Star Trek, back in the day had, on female astronauts, wanting to go and explore space and trying to go on the space program and things like that. It's the same effect in terms of science with Scully. She's cast a real, long, shadow into the empowerment of women to do these kind of careers. It's fantastic. It really is.
It is. And if you recall the first Star Trek, if you recall the pilot, they had a woman as second in command. And that was the way the script was originally written. And the studio said that they couldn't, that wasn't going to work, that a woman couldn't be in second of command. And so that was the woman, the actress became the nurse for the series. And they put Mr. Spock as second in command. But originally it was a woman. And so this was back in the mid-'60s. And so it wasn't until the 90s that all of a sudden you have a character like Dana Scully. I mean, it's hard to imagine that now, in 2018, that not so long ago, women couldn't be in these positions in television series.
Yeah, we've come a long way. We've come a long way. And it's, now there is a lot, especially in television, perhaps even more than cinema, there is a lot more representation of strong female characters in these kind of roles. You only have to look at a lot of different shows that have followed the X-Files, things like Fringe, which has a female character at the very centre of it and things like that. So it's an important role. So it's great. It really is great. And so Scully comes up so often when I ask this question for obvious reasons. She is the heart and soul, really, of the entire show.
It really is her show. I mean, it's her development. It's her, starting out as this skeptic and then becoming a full partner and becoming just, the kind of the emotional center of the show. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why she would be a character who was picked by a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So finally then, for the 5 questions of X, what would you say overall from the X-Files that you've seen that your favourite moment is from the entire series?
Well,
far.
Yeah, as I'm sitting here talking about how important it is that scientists are portrayed in a favourable light as people who are helping the investigations, my favorite moment has to be the moment of the mad scientist in Postmodern Prometheus. Because when that actor stands there and the lightning flashes behind him and Mulder is asking him, why are you trying to put legs in the mouths of fruit flies?
Yeah.
And he goes, because I can. And that's just such a moment. And it's a moment where, the entire audience, shrieks in laughter because it's just such a great moment, the way it's filmed, the actor. I mean, everything about that moment is just quintessential X-Files. And so that's the moment. I love that moment.
It is. It's quite an ironic moment for you, I suppose.
It's a very ironic moment. And the only thing that I can say is that it's a very comedic, it's very comedic and quite controversial these days. But at the time, it was a very comedic moment. And I still like watching it.
Yeah, it still works. It still holds up in many ways. So yeah, it's a good choice. It's a really good choice. Some great answers there, Anne. It really does paint a nice picture of the elements of the X-Files.
Mother's Day is almost here, and you can get her the most beautiful time-tested gift around. A watch she can wear every day from Movement. Whether mom's into classic dress watches, rare and refined ceramics, or tried and true bestsellers, Movement has something she'll love. And right now you can save big on the best Mother's Day gift ever with up to 50% off site-wide during Movement's Mother's Day sale at MVMT.com. Again, that's up to 50% off at MVMT.com.
That you really enjoy. So it's I always enjoy doing the 5 questions of X because you get some really great answers from that. But let's move on and talk a little bit about your book, the real science behind the X-Files: Microbes, Meteorites, and Mutants, which was published, I think, back in 1999. Have I got that right?
The hardcover was in 1999, and the paperback was in 2000, I think.
2000. So it's been quite some years since you published this book. Longer than I thought, actually. When I came to read it, I was surprised that it was before the end of the original run of the show. I think that was around season 7. I think that was roughly. So yeah, it's been quite some time. How do you feel about the book now when you look back on it from a distance?
I'm amazed that I wrote it. I mean, I love my last chapter. It was a chapter that was very difficult to write on the environment and ecology, and because that's not my subject. And I loved writing it, and I just wanted to put everything that I love about science and the X-Files into it. I had to binge watch every single episode in like 2 weeks while maintaining my full-time job. And writing it was so difficult. I mean, I didn't have any weekend or evening free for an entire year. But I was so pleased after the book came out to get these wonderful emails from especially high school kids who would say, oh, my parents, they gave me this book, and it's on science, but I love the X-Files, so I decided, well, I'll read the first couple pages, and then I couldn't put it down, and now I love science, and I want to go into science, and I gave it to my science teacher, and I mean, just getting those emails from people and hearing about how much they loved reading about science. I mean, it truly was life-altering to do that. So I'm very, very glad that I did it. I never thought I would do anything like that. But I'm so pleased that people still read it, still buy it, read it, and find so much to like and so much interesting things about science. So it really gets them interested in subjects that I feel very strongly everybody should know more about.
Obviously, if people aren't 100% sure about the book in terms of what it is, you ultimately take certain episodes from the show and you compare the either the supernatural or the scientific ideas that are going on in those shows. For instance, the Tunguska meteorite rock, which crashes in the episode Tunguska. And you unpick then the real science behind these supernatural ideas or these paranormal ideas, like the tree bugs in Darkness Falls, or this kind of thing. And I think it's a great concept for a book, Anne. It really is. And I think I will pay probably what I would consider the biggest compliment about this now, in that I am so bad at science. And in terms of my knowledge, all the time, whenever we're watching things like David Attenborough documentaries, on the BBC, which are amazing, and I'm sitting there going, how is that wow! I'm just blown. My mind is blown all the time, and my fiance laughs at me quite often for it. But reading this book, I genuinely came out of it really, really interested in the topics. I think the way it's written is really engaging for somebody who doesn't know anything about science or has very little knowledge, and that tethering it to these X-Files, it gives you that extra little bit of interest because you've already seen the parasites in ice, and the story in the show. But then to get this extra science behind it, it just works. It's a great idea for a book, and I genuinely, as I've been reading it, I'm really going, wow! I've learnt so much from this book, and I really, really enjoyed it in that context because I'm one of those people who knew nothing. So
it's great hearing that. I tried so hard to do that. As a professor, I teach introduction to biology. So I was trying to use, all of the fun things that I use in my class to try to get students to understand these concepts. And I thought, well, I can put this into a book and just use the X-Files. And I actually had 2 readers of the chapters before I would give it to my editor. One reader was my mother, who didn't know anything about science. And the other reader was Chris Carter's wife, Dory, who also didn't know anything about science. And she's a writer as well. And so, both of them were really enthusiastic and excited about the chapters. So I thought, okay, well, now they're ready to go to the editor. And who really liked it too. So
yeah, that's great. That's the key, isn't it? You got people who didn't know anything about science to go, oh yeah, that's really good. It does work in that context, definitely. And it covers all kinds of things, doesn't it? I mean, that's the thing. You mentioned earlier that the ecology section was harder to write. Was it a challenge bringing all these different scientific concepts together?
It was a challenge figuring out what episodes to use. So that was a challenge. And then, yes, I mean, originally one of the ideas that the editor wanted me to do was something about artificial intelligence, which would have been even harder. But I wanted a chapter on the environment. I mean, global warming is I mean, it's here, it's happening, it's real. And I'd like to apologize for, the leadership of the United States right now. But virtually every scientist on the planet understands that this is real. And back, this was 18 years ago. It was just coming out as a very important topic. And so it was something that I really wanted to put in the book. And as I was reading up for that chapter, one of the things that really struck home, and which I didn't know before, were all of the species that were going extinct. That so many birds and so many amphibians and fish and primates were going extinct all over the world. And why is this happening? And what can we do to try to mitigate this, what really is going to be a catastrophe? And as I say in the book, we can't point to a meteor like we can point to and say, this is why the dinosaurs died off. People will be, in the future, will be pointing at us. So I'm hoping that people read that chapter and really thought about, that we are custodians of this earth, and we need to pay a lot more attention to keep it the way it is for future generations.
It must be. You alluded to it what you just said, but it must be difficult for you right now with the current political climate and everything that, as you say, the leadership of the US is saying. And there's, I can promise you that a great many people in the UK and almost certainly the rest of Europe are just as in disbelief and frustration about a lot of this as you are. And I think is it a difficult point right now to be a scientist in the Western world?
It's difficult for a lot of reasons. I mean, we're very dependent on funding, and the priorities of many governments are going away from funding, especially basic science, where the wonderful things that are going to happen in the future depend on us coming up with, brilliant ideas right now, and ideas that maybe don't have an application in the near future. But it's this kind of science that's so important, and there's less and less money for it. So as we in science like to say, we're one, grant proposal being turned down away from our labs collapsing. So it's a lot of frustration and anxiety. But you just keep going. I mean, I've always been funded, and you keep going and you keep trying to push the envelope. But I think that my field, which is molecular biology and viruses, people are always going to be scared of viruses. With this bad flu season right now, there'll probably still remain, funding for virology. But I feel very, very bad for people who are, working on climate change and global warming, especially when you have agencies in the U.S. that can no longer even use the words climate change or global warming, and that you're not allowed to put those words in a grant proposal for them. This is just extremely sad, and one is just looking forward to the time when this will not be happening.
Yes, yeah. Hopefully that time will be
very soon.
Within the next few years.
Yeah, as soon as possible.
As soon as possible, absolutely. And, it's quite telling that a lot of the new season of The X-Files is quite an indictment against this current political system. And I think, obviously, Chris Carter is tapping into that quite succinctly. And, of course, he wrote the foreword for your book, didn't he? Which is a great foreword. So that must have been really great to have him write and contribute to that.
That was absolutely wonderful, because I wanted people to know that he is really connected to the science, and the science plays such an important role in the entire series. And he loves science. His brother's a scientist, a professor at MIT in physical science, and for someone who was not trained as a scientist, he reads voraciously. I'm always sending him links to interesting articles, and which he reads and he asks me about later. And so I think he just getting back to the last episode of the last season, he became so interested in this whole new CRISPR system, this idea that we can very precisely change genes in whole organisms. And he became very, very interested in that. And he loves the fact that most people didn't know about it before the X-Files.
Well, there's so many instances though in the show, and there's quite a lot of things that you talk about in your book actually that are examples of that. That there are things that people didn't really know about until the X-Files presented them, and there's just as many in terms of science as there are conspiracy theories. And obviously Chris Carter very well. But I've always suspected that he's far more interested in the scientific underpinnings of everything in the X-Files than he is in the supernatural and the paranormal aspects. They're obviously the big draw for a lot of people. But it's always struck me that I've always felt that he is ultimately much more of a Scully than a Mulder. And I don't know if you agree or you think that's the case, but that's how it's always come across.
Oh, I absolutely believe that. He's much more Scully than Mulder. I mean, it's a science fiction show, so clearly the paranormal is a very important part of the show, but it's the science that really drives the show as well. And certainly when we put a lot, I mean, when I was reading the script that he was writing for My Struggle Too, I kept saying, this is a lot of science in here. Do you want all of this science? I mean, I'm not sure if the audience is going to understand what they're saying. And he said, no, I want the science in there. I want it to sound like two scientists really talking about it. And I said, great. I was really happy.
Yeah, but that comes out, you know, that you feel that, you know, you really, it's been a long time, in fact, since you had that sense of real science coming into the show. It reminded me of the Erlenmeyer flask in some respects, and the scene which you mention in your book between Scully and Dr. Ann Carpenter, who was, of course, named partially after you, and the great story in the book is about why that was changed, because she was originally supposed to be Anne Simon, wasn't she?
She was supposed to be Anne Simon, and actually in the script, it's Anne Simon. So in my copy of the script, it says Anne Simon. No one else sees that, of course, but unfortunately, there isn't. You know, they were basing it at I believe it was Georgetown Medical School, and there is an Anne Simon there in the microbiology department, and
what
so they had to change the name. And Chris was very apologetic about it.
It reminded me of the Erlenmeyer flask, and I that scene, and obviously the fate of Dr. Carpenter, has always stuck with me over the years. And you know, I love the Erlenmeyer flask; it's one of my favourite episodes, and there's so much interesting science in there. And as I say, you go into detail on the basics of the, you know, the nucleotides and that kind of thing in the book. But is that must be a particularly favourite episode, or an interesting episode for you at least, Anne? You know, given the science in that and the underpinnings.
Yes, I mean, if I had to pick an additional favorite episode, it would certainly be the Erlenmeyer flask, because that was the first episode that I helped with, and there was so much in there that Chris wanted. I mean, he wanted to know, if you were handed a strange microorganism, how would you study it? So, you know, I went through this long how I would study it. You know, you'd have to grow more of it. It would take you about 10 years to figure that out. He thought that'd be boring, so it was already growing. And then he wanted to know, you know, what would you do? What would you do next? And you'd look at it under a microscope, and then that was when I started getting kind of clever. And I said, you know, but he wanted it to be like an alien bacteria. And I said, but alien, you know, bacteria are so boring. You know, they're just round and they're just not very interesting, not very visual. I said, why not use pollen? And he thought, yeah, pollen. Pollen looks so cool. And so he actually found a picture of a scanning EM. I told him to use a scanning electron microscope. And he found a picture in a magazine, an advertisement for hay fever medicine. And he used that picture. Because this microscope you don't look into, it's on a video monitor. And then he said, okay, but so the key question that he asked me was, what could the scientists find that would instantly scream out to her, this is alien? So that was actually when he said that to me, that was the first time that I knew that these really were aliens. So and he's on the phone. I have to come up with it really fast. So I started thinking of all these different things, but it has to be simple. And so I thought, well, why not? Since everything on the planet has the same 4 nucleotides in their DNA, if this thing had 6 nucleotides, that would make it by definition extraterrestrial. And so that started this whole extra nucleotides in the alien, which continued on into My Struggle Too. And
Mother's Day is almost here. And you can get her the most beautiful time-tested gift around. A watch she can wear every day from Movement. Whether mom's into classic dress watches, rare and refined ceramics, or tried and true bestsellers, Movement has something she'll love. And right now you can save big on the best Mother's Day gift ever with up to 50% off site-wide during Movement's Mother's Day sale at MVMT.com. Again, that's up to 50% off at MVMT.com.
Why this alien DNA and Scully's DNA is different, and it has the extra 2 nucleotides, and it's why one of the experiments they were doing didn't work. And so it continued for all of these years, and it was just based on me on the phone trying to come up with something quickly that Chris would say, yeah, okay, that sounds good.
But it's something that really has really stuck with fans. And I honestly, and every time I watch that scene in the Erlenmeyer Flask, I get chills. There is just something, the way that the actress portrays it, the conversation, Scully's wide-eyed, oh my God, this is actually alien. There's no way around it.
There's no way around it, yeah.
Yeah, and the way it was filmed. So, the added fact as to how you came up with the visual of that and actually helping to sell it, it just works. It's a really, really great scene, and it makes that episode even better. So it's really interesting. You mentioned earlier about your contributions to Postmodern Prometheus as well. So what specifically did you add to that, or what kind of science did you bring to that episode?
Well, over the years when I was helping, I was always trying to come up with ideas for episodes. And I would give Chris all these ideas, and he'd go, yeah, okay. And then that would be it. But I remember that I was on the set one day, and I was sitting on the couch in his trailer. And I said, there are these great fruit flies that I think would make great Monster of the Week, episode for the X-Files. And so I started telling him about these fruit flies that have legs coming out of their mouths or legs in place of antennas. And they're called homeotic mutants. There's a single gene defect, and you can get legs in place of antenna, or you can get legs in place of the mandibles. And I said, that, doesn't that sound like a great monster? Legs? I mean, it's a little fruit fly, so it's not very big. And he was absolutely fascinated. He said, well, where can I see these? I said, well, they're not flying around. But I said at Indiana University, where I was a graduate student, they keep a repository of these fruit flies. I said, if you went to Indiana, you could see them. He said, great. Can you call them up and tell them I want to come see the fruit flies? So that led to actually a very funny story, because I had been a graduate student there and a postdoc there. But I hadn't been back for many years. It was probably about 15 years. So I didn't know if anyone would remember me. And here, I'm trying to establish my career as a scientist, serious scientist. And I was going to call my old professors there and say, I'm helping with this series that they may have never heard of called the X-Files. So I called an old professor who was in charge of these flies, and Dr. Tom Kaufman, who's a very famous developmental biologist. I call him on the phone and I say, hi, Tom, this is Ann Simon. I was a student there many years ago. And he goes, oh, yeah. No, I mean, he said that. I'm sure he didn't remember me. And I said, well, so I started saying all the good things. Well, I got these grants, and I'm a associate professor, and I'm this, and I'm at, this university. And so all the stuff that says, hey, I've actually got a career. And then I said, but I also help on the science on this TV series. And I thought, oh, he's not going to know it, called The X-Files. And he goes, The X-Files? I love The X-Files. My family loves The X-Files. My lab loves The X-Files. I said, oh, you're going to really like this, because Chris Carter wants to come and see the flies. So I said, he's going to call you, and he may not call for weeks, but it's not a crank call. And have him come out and see the flies. So Chris went out a month or two later, and he came back with a T-shirt and a diagram and all the explanations of why he's working on these flies, and all of it was used in the show. But Chris had to call me after that and say, I have no idea why he's doing these experiments. And so I had to give the explanation that Scully actually gives Mulder. And he wrote that episode based on it. And the funny thing was, when Tom Kaufman was given a great honor in the Developmental Biology Society, when they were calling him up to the stage, they started playing that on the screen. This whole, the film loop that Tom had given him, and showing Tom's fruit flies and everything. And the whole audience was just screaming with laughter. So a lot of people know about that episode. But that was my one little contribution before My Struggle 2. That was the big one.
Yeah, it's a good one though. It's a really good one. Was there a period then between the two where between obviously that was season 5, so that's around 1997, 1998, and then obviously My Struggle 2, quite a long way after. Was there a period where you were still involved in the show, or in the later years, were you still around, involved, or did it mainly happen when the revival came around?
No, there were still some little things. There was, I'm not remembering the titles of the episodes, but there was an episode where in Africa, and Scully's looking at this spaceship, and she's saying that there are these panels on the ship, and they're representing the human chromosomes, and so that was me. And yeah, I mean, those little things. And then in this episode called Redux, too, I can't remember if it was before or after the Postmodern Prometheus. A lot of that episode I helped with. I had to figure out how you could tag someone with the smallpox vaccine. And then so that was another fun story, because we actually were in the vaccine, we were causing a little blueprint on people's skins that was kind of like a code, and you could see it under a microscope. And if you sequenced the protein, if you determined the amino acid sequence of the protein, you figured out what that protein was, and it was based on the smallpox protein was particular proteins. And they actually showed, I told Chris, I said, if you're going to show the sequence of the protein on the video monitor, don't just make it up. He wanted to hide my name in it. And I said, no, don't do that. Use a real protein sequence for the protein we're talking about. And so he said, okay. So I sent him the protein sequence, and he used it. And the funny thing was, this was before people knew I was helping with the show. I had just, right after that episode aired, a colleague of mine came to the University of Massachusetts, where I was at the time, and I was having dinner with him, and he said the most amazing thing happened. He was teaching his show about how you can do searches based on, an amino acid sequence. You could do a search and find out what the protein was. So he said, there was this episode of the X-Files, and he said he was going to show the class how this ridiculous thing that they were showing on the video monitor couldn't possibly be a protein. And so he said he loaded that protein sequence into his computer, and he, pressed the return button, and it searched, and it came out that it was the smallpox virus protein number 11 or something, and he was just completely floored that they used the actual sequence that they were talking about.
That's incredible, yeah.
Yeah, and he said he just had to tell someone. I felt like saying, yeah, that was me, but I didn't.
That's great, though, that you were still involved in various things. Did you have any real involvement, Anne, in the development of the black oil virus, the big alien virus that became part of the main season mythology, or was that more Chris Carter and the team around him?
Well, the first movie, I helped a lot with that. And so the idea that Chris's original idea for the science made no sense. His original idea, really no sense. Less sense than these paranormal, crazy ideas of mine. But he wanted a virus to be the original inhabitant of the planet. And it's like, okay, well, that's okay. But what he wanted is this black oil virus to get inside someone, and when it was inside someone, it mutated and became this horrible, hideous creature. And I'm like, my hands over my mouth. He's on the phone with me, and I'm like, Chris, a virus can't mutate into anything. It can't do that. There's more chance of a desk mutating into a horrible creature than a virus. At least it's made of wood, which is cells. So I said, what if we kind of changed that? What if we had the virus in the black oil get into, a cell, and then the virus gets into your genome, and that happens. There's a lot of viruses that do this, that actually attach themselves to your genome. HIV is one of them. And when it gets into your genome, it changes, it reorganizes the genome so that the cell then mutates and starts developing into a horrible, hideous creature. And he liked that. And so and so that's what the science became in the movie. So the important thing was, if I was going to try to change his ideas about science, it had to be something he liked better. So that's always the key to being a science advisor, is you have to come up with something that the writer will like more than what they've come up with.
That's really interesting, because in previous episodes before the movie, the black oil virus essentially was more of a body jumping, possessing sort of alien creature, and then once we got to the movie, it has this mechanism where it creates an extraterrestrial biological entity in a human host, obviously, and that's what you've just been talking about. And it's really interesting how the whole concept of the biology of this alien creature, this virus, became much more of a scientific basis after you got involved and started consulting.
Yes,
and that carried on through the season.
I wish that everyone who wrote any science in any TV show or movie would consult with a scientist. And in fact, there's the National Academy of Sciences here in the U.S. Came up with this wonderful idea that they've been doing now for a number of years, called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. And this is where they've got a lot of scientists, including me, and they pair us up with writers. And so a writer will get in touch with them and say, I really need to talk to a scientist who knows a lot about cells. And so they'll find someone, they'll say, are you interested in helping? It's like, yes. And then you have these wonderful conversations with the writers where you get them to be a little bit more scientific. It's just as interesting. It's just more real. Yeah. And we like it when the science is more accurate. Scientists really love the truth. We're all about the truth. And another reason why, there was a lot of, as people in the UK will see, there's a lot of references to that in some of these episodes, because that's becoming something that is troubling a lot of people in the U.S. today. This that there's alternative truths, which of course there are not.
No, absolutely not. No, that is a really great idea, actually, in terms of television, because you so often it's much easier for writers just to skip over a fact, isn't it? Skip over okay, it's just entertainment. We'll just do what we want. But then you do have people sitting at home who will be more satisfied when there's a real level of reality to it. A lot we've been talking about the X-Files. One of the reasons I'm convinced the X-Files is so well regarded is because it does this. It consults with someone like yourself and gets the details right in a lot of ways, and that goes a long way. That's why I think My Struggle 2 ended up being such an interesting episode, because it was rooted in science, and that must have been, to have a story credit, Anne, must have been a real thrill for you to actually get on in that way.
Well, it's my other favorite moment of the X-Files was actually seeing my name on the screen as story by. I actually have that film shot up in my office. But yeah, I mean, that doesn't happen to science advisors. And so for Christy and me and my friend Margaret Fearon, who helps with the medical, she's a medical doctor, and Margaret's also my best friend, and I met her through the X-Files. She read my book, and she emailed me and said, I read your book, I loved it, and I'm a virologist as well. And I emailed her back, and that was a long time ago, 19 years ago. And we've been wonderful friends ever since. And she was such a fan of the X-Files, and she gets to go on the set with me, and she's become very good friends with Chris and Dory. And so it's been, so the X-Files gave me my best friend as well as, this wonderful additional activity that I do besides my, my hard science, my real life.
That's so lovely. That really is lovely. That's another testament to the show. How did the obviously, as you say, Margaret Fearon, I was going to mention her actually, and she was involved in My Struggle 2 as well. How did the correspondence work then? Did Chris Carter approach you with ideas, or was it were you on set working with him? Was it much more of an email correspondence? How did it work with that episode?
Well, actually, when I found out there was going to be a revival of the X-Files, which I heard just from Twitter, I was so excited that on my way home from work, I came up with this idea about having something go on with the genome, that there's something in the genomes of everybody, and that something's going to happen because of it. That as soon as I got home, I called Chris. And I said, I have a wonderful idea. You know, it's kind of like my postmodern Prometheus idea. And he said, don't tell me. He said, I'm like a day away from finishing the episode, My Struggle 1. And he said, as soon as I finish, I'll send it to you. And then you can tell me your idea. So he finished it. I was probably the first person to see it besides him. I really liked it. It was a very difficult episode to write because it was for old fans and hopefully new fans, and we had to recap and start new things, and it's very difficult. But I realized that my idea would fit right in, and so he modified that episode to fit the idea in. And then for My Struggle 2, Margaret and I were both on the set watching Babylon being filmed. And he said, I want you to, and I had already come up with this CRISPR idea. He had called me. And so that was already, I wrote pages up on that for him. And so he said, I want the two of you to go into a room, our hotel room, and not come out until you find a way to put this into the genome of people. So we both went into the room and we came up with this Spartan virus. And we figured, okay, well, we could deliver it with the smallpox vaccine because nobody gets those anymore. We don't want to make people scared of getting vaccines. And so Chris really liked it. And so that's how Margaret ended up getting involved. She also was able to tell Chris what an anthrax sore would look like and symptoms and how one would react to it. And because she's an infectious disease expert, and she was actually in charge of SARS when that broke out in Toronto. She was the head medical microbiologist who specialized in virology. So Margaret's on the front lines of all of this, and so she was able to add quite a lot of realism there. And so she got story credit too, so we all shared. It was great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. It is really nice that you were both so involved and really helping to come up with that story and everything. And I suppose, did you know at the time what Chris Carter was planning with it being in Scully's mind's eye in that sense? Or was that something that was a bit of a later surprise?
No, I knew. I mean, the problem was, I mean, you've got this end of the world scenario, and when I read the script and I saw that he was going to have this huge scene at the end and this cliffhanger, and that was the end, and I'm going, Chris, we have to come up with a way to save everybody, and okay, so there's her blood and there's this, and we were coming up with all of these different ways of saving people, in the long run, and he said, well, we don't really have to. And so actually 4 of us knew that it was ascending. So Margaret knew, I knew, Chris knew, and I think Gabe Trotter, his associate producer, knew. And besides that was it. So, but I didn't know who sent it, and I don't want to give it away. I don't want to give it away just in case the episode hasn't aired yet. But it was not who I thought had sent it.
Well, this brings me on to some fan questions now. People who are XCast listeners who have I asked for questions to put to you, and there's some interesting ones, and one from Kimon Keramidas, who is a guy who's very into the mythology and all the ins and outs. He said that you mentioned on Twitter presumably, that Chris Carter cut the last 10 pages of My Struggle 2 and created that cliffhanger. So he's interested in, and you may not want to give this away, obviously, but he's interested in, was the plot of My Struggle 3 those 10 pages, or are we going to see that in presumably My Struggle 4, if that is what it's called, the finale, or at any point? You may not want to give that away, Anne.
Yes, I can't give that away. But I actually only knew about the first episode of this season, since I saw that being filmed.
Okay.
I don't know about the other episodes. So I am, like all fans, I am waiting to see what happens.
Well, he's another question off the back of that from the same person was that how involved were you in season 11, and do you know if there's any particular science in the next for American viewers the next 6 episodes, for UK viewers the entire season?
So I really was not involved much at all in this season. When I read the first script, I noticed something that didn't make sense, and I mentioned it to Chris, and he changed it. But besides that, no, I'm just waiting to see what goes on, and since we don't have to cure everybody,
yeah, that's helpful. That helps you out definitely. Okay, well, it's nice you get to see it as a fan, as well as everybody else.
And he wants me to. He won't tell me about the episodes. All he'll say is, I think you're going to really like this one. So, and then I email him with what I thought, and I email him with the reaction of fans on Twitter.
That must be nice, because he doesn't do social media, I don't think, does he?
No, he doesn't.
So it's nice. It must be nice for him to get a lot of positive feedback from fans about these new episodes.
I think, well, when the fans like the episodes, it definitely.
Well, yeah. But
fans have been extremely enthusiastic, especially about the last 2.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of obviously My Struggle 3 was a bit polarizing in places, but there's been a lot of positive response, I think, for this season. There's a real buzz around it. I've been saying that on this podcast a few times. There's a real buzz around this season. I think people are really enjoying it on the whole. So, yeah, it's great. It really is. Question from Reynard Muldrake on Twitter. Are there any instances where you provided advice to the writers where they've said, well, that's even stranger than what we were thinking. We can't fit that into the episode, or any instances where things you suggested did make it in or didn't make it in?
There's actually, when I think back to the first 9 years of the episode, there was only one time when I said something and it didn't make it in. And that was, Mulder had referred to the Martian meteorite. Okay. And he'd mentioned, I'm trying to think back, but he'd mentioned that it was a recent landing of the meteorite. And I said to Chris, no, it's not recent. It's really been there a long time. And he said, Mulder can be wrong.
Can he?
He said, yeah, Mulder can be wrong. If it was Scully, I think he would have changed it. But he said,
we've not seen
Mulder.
That very often. Mulder being wrong doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, Mulder, he can be wrong.
Okay, well, one from Jules on Twitter. We may have talked about this a little bit earlier, but how hard is it to tread that line between pure science fiction and fact in a show that is based in the fantastic? That's a really insightful question, actually.
Very insightful. You never forget that this is science fiction. It's not supposed to be real. And so you just want it to sound real. I think the important thing is you want what the scientists are doing to be real. How are the scientists, trying to analyze something which is clearly fantastical, but what the scientists are doing should be real. So I think that's the really, important part of being a science advisor, is at least let's let that aspect, it doesn't matter how crazy the science fiction is. The scientists are going to view it as, let's look for the evidence. Let's try to figure out what this thing is. When you're handed a strange microorganism, your first thought isn't this came from, Venus. Your first thought is this is something that's strange, and it's probably related to something on this planet if you don't think it's from off the planet. So how would you investigate it? And that should be real.
It gives it that grounding, doesn't it? To leap off into the fantastical, absolutely. Teresa Rothar on Facebook just wants to say thanks to you and everyone else for all the memories. We've had your fondest, your most interesting episodes or the things you've enjoyed. What is your fondest memory from your time working on the show? And again, we may have covered this earlier, but what would you say your fondest memory is?
My fondest memory has to be helping Chris with My Struggle 2. Just reading it. He was it was a very difficult time because he was directing Babylon at the same time he was writing. And so, when the cast and crew would have lunch, he would go back to his trailer and I'd go with him, and he would try to get 5 minutes of sleep, and I would be reading what he had wrote that morning. So he'd be getting off from the X-Files at about 2 a.m, getting up at about 6 a.m, writing until 10, until the limousine came and picked us up. And so it was a very difficult time, and I was trying to, just help as much as possible. And in the meantime, I was watching the scene from Babylon, which is the bar scene where Mulder's dancing, which was clear. I mean, that was just a blast to watch that being filmed. So that has to be my favorite moment. Absolutely.
It does sound so collaborative in a really good way.
It was, and it was. I would love to have had that happen again because it was terrific.
Fingers crossed somehow. Even if it's some kind of alternate reality parallel universe, we get a season 12.
I want a season 12. I know I've been tweeting that it's going to be so sad. I'm not going to be able to do this anymore, but I'm just kind of preparing myself.
Yeah, I think we're all under the impression this is the final season. So, but we live in hope.
Yes,
as ever with the X-Files. It's not necessarily the end. Just one or two more. Carl Sweeney on Facebook, one of our co-hosts. He asks, is there any chance of a new X-Files book from you, Anne, or a revised update of the original one?
Well, I've had a lot of people ask me that, and it's intriguing to think of updating the book. So I think that this is something that could happen. I could possibly be interested in updating it because there's been so much cool science in the last 2 seasons, and also in the seasons that occurred after the book was written, and also just updating the science that's in the book. Many more organisms have been cloned. There's a lot more. I mean, they just cloned the first monkeys, apparently. Right. I haven't read the paper, but it just came out. I mean, I saw it, a headline about it. So there's a lot more science that has gone on since the book was written, and it would be really fun to update it. I just think it's going to be very sad to update the last chapter and talk about how, we really have not done what we should have to try to prevent the kind of climate catastrophe that we're beginning to get inklings of, these very severe tornadoes and hurricanes, and I think that's just very sad. So I think that would be a sad chapter to update. Yeah. But the rest of it, yes, I think it would be fun to update the science.
I think it's absolutely screaming to be written down, to be honest. And reading this book, and I'm thinking it's fantastic, but it'd be so great to get some of the extra stuff from later seasons, and as you say, the revival. So yeah, if the opportunity comes along, I think there'd be a hell of a lot of fans out there who would be super excited to see that book. Definitely. So maybe if we don't get a season 12, that can keep us going.
For the meantime. You say that. Thank you.
Finally, then, one last question, and this comes from Wendy on Twitter, and it's a simple one and a sort of a core one, really. Are you a believer? And do you believe in aliens, the paranormal, or as a scientist, are you purely a skeptic?
I think there's no question, absolutely no question, that there is life elsewhere. I think there's so many different planets that are the right distance from their sun to support life. I mean, it's not going to be life like we know it. It may be very different from the life that we know. But life never, nonetheless. So yes, I cannot believe in the, what is it now, almost 15 billion years that the universe has been here, that there isn't life elsewhere. So I definitely believe that. Now the other, the rest of it, let's just say that I am certainly a skeptic, but at the same time, like any good scientist, I will look at all of the evidence. And if the evidence causes me to change my mind, then I will change my mind.
Yeah, fantastic, open-minded way to look at it. You'll become Scully in the later seasons of the X-Files when she starts to believe a little more, when the when the science is there, proving all the facts.
I think that if I had been faced with all of the evidence that Scully got, I would have been a believer a lot sooner than she was.
That's true. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably very true. Okay. Some great questions there from listeners. Thank you, everyone, who sent us in a question. And thank you, Anne, for this fantastic discussion. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you about all this. So it's been great to have you on the show. It really has.
Well, it's been wonderful talking with you. And as I say, the listeners in the UK have just a wonderful, wonderful 10 weeks to look forward to when this show starts airing.
They really do. They really do. And hopefully, as we said earlier, it's here now for you, or it's on the verge of being here. So you'll be getting My Struggle 3 and kicking off the season. So, look, check out Channel 5 in the UK for that, guys. And make sure you check out Anne's book, if you haven't already, The Real Science Behind the X-Files, which you can find on Amazon, but in both the UK and the US, wherever you're based. And it's at a really, really good price. So, give it a read. It's really great for anyone who loves science or who doesn't know much about science like me. You will really, really enjoy it. So, make sure you buy it, because then maybe, like we say, we'll get the update that Anne wants to write. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll be back soon for more coverage of season 11, continuing the journey. And just keep making sure you check out our social media pages, and remember our Patreon at patreon.com/the XCast. So until next time, remember, as always, trust no one. The XCast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook at the XCast and X-Files podcast, or our Facebook group, the XCast Basement and X-Files podcast fan group. And our title song is by Will A, who you can find on Twitter at I am Will A-Y-E.